Thank you for joining us tonight. We are currently playing a pre-event slideshow. The first slide shows the Live logo in gold on a white background with the text. Live from NYPL presents Immigration History, Politics, and Prejudices. Jia-Lin Yang with Caitlin Dickerson. May 25th, 2021, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. This slide shows an image of the featured book. The cover of the book is an old black and white photograph showing a large cluster of people in the foreground, smiling and waving hats at the Statue of Liberty, which is visible across the water in the distance. The text reads, Jia-Lin Yang, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, 1924 to 1965. One Mighty and Irresistible Tide is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shoplive. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide contains recommended reading. NYPL suggests these titles for further reading. City of Dreams by Tyler N. Binder. A Nation of Immigrants Reconsidered, edited by Maddalena Marinari, Madeline Y. Sue, and Maria Cristina Garcia. The Making of Asian America by Erica Lee. Impossible Subject by May Nye. And The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter. Check out the full list and reserve these titles by visiting tonight's event page, nypl.org/live.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming back to Live from NYPL. Tonight, we're lucky to have with us New York Times national editor Jia-Lin Yang. Jia-Lin is the author of the excellent book of history, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, which just came out in paperback today. And she's here to talk about it with fellow Times reporter Caitlin Dickerson, who writes on national immigration issues for the paper. Which is perfect. Jia-Lin's book is subtitled The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, 1924 to 1965. And it looks at that under-noticed but extremely crucial period of American immigration history, from the passage of the bigoted and exclusionary Immigration Act of 1924 to its essential repeal with the passage of the 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act. And because a huge part of that story is the near total ban of anyone trying to immigrate here from Asia, I'm glad that we can share this event with you during Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month. AAPI Month pays tribute to the generations of Asians and Pacific Islanders who have enriched America's history and are instrumental in our future. While this country lost out on generations of Asian people enriching our history and future, thanks to the racism and bigotry embedded in parts of our past immigration policy. And I'm grateful that we can take this moment to acknowledge and confront that history as part of our history. My name is Aidan Flax Clark, by the way. I am part of the team that brings you live from NYPL, so I am grateful to each of you who is here with us tonight. Now, of course, you'll want to read Jia-Lin's book if you haven't already, and I couldn't encourage you more to do that. It's not only fascinating, revelatory, and crucial, it is a pure pleasure to read. And I've got options for you on how to do that. If you have an NYPL library card, or you live in New York State and you want to apply for one now, you can borrow One Mighty and Irresistible Tide for free. Many more of our locations are opening up right now for grab-and-go service, so you could get a real copy of the book. And it's also available on our app, Simply Eat. If you scroll down on the event page that you're hopefully on right now, you can find out how to reserve your copy. And if you're able, you can buy Jia-Lin's book from the library shop. Proceeds go to benefit the library, and you can find the link to buy it also on the event page, and we'll drop it in the chat too. Okay, now I have one favor to ask you, speaking of looking at things on our website. I'd love for you to go to nypl.org/live and check out some of the events that we have coming up next month, because there are a lot. Salman Rushdie and Taya Obrecht, Theodore R. Johnson with Leah Wright Rigueur, Gillian Tett and Tom Friedman, Derek Delgadio and Neil Gaiman, and a big birthday blowout for Octavia E. Butler. And there's actually even more than that. So go to nypl.org/live, check it all out, and of course, register, for everything. Okay, before I turn it over to tonight's speakers, just a few quick housekeeping items. The library values your privacy, so in the spirit of transparency, there are a few things that we want you to know. Even though the video and the chat that you're looking at are on the NYPL website, they're actually hosted by YouTube. So if you want to participate in the chat, you might share some data about yourself, and the library doesn't control that. You can learn more about how that works also on the event page. Lastly, Jia-Lin would love to answer some of your questions tonight. You can send them at any time on the event page, in the chat, using the Google form, or you can email publicprograms@nypl.org. Okay, that's it. So let's please bring on Caitlin Dickerson and Jia-Lin Yang.
Hello. Thank you to everyone who's here with us virtually. It's wonderful to be here with the New York Public Library and with Jia-Lin Yang, who's national editor of the New York Times, my former colleague and the author of One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, 1924 to 1965. Before reading her book, I knew Jia-Lin as an incisive, brilliant journalist who had a firm grasp of politics, both the micro of what was happening in Washington, D.C., and the macro of what major issues were dividing the country. And so it was a pleasure for me to be able to read as she turned those skills to an issue that I cover as a reporter, but also that feels no less pressing now than it has, I think, at any other time in American history. We've got a lot of ground to cover, Jia-Lin. So I thought we would start, though, with your decision to write the book. You write a little bit about your personal connection to the story through your family. You're also a journalist, and so may have felt drawn to it for that reason as well. So can you just talk about why you decided to write the book?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone this evening. Thank you, Caitlin, for being here too. It's so good to see you. I dug into the book out of a sense of real, just deep personal curiosity. My family is from China and Taiwan. I was really familiar with the story of why we left those places for here. It was, like a lot of immigrants who come here, there was political upheaval in China, which sent my family to Taiwan. Then my parents came to the US for, their education, for graduate school. They stayed, they had me, I was born here. And that to me was kind of the whole story. And my uncles and aunts are here with cousins. But when I came across this law, just on a trip to the Lyndon Johnson Presidential Library in Austin, I started to wonder, is there a connection between this law, which in the museum, it just said very simply, this law explains why there's so many Asian Americans here and immigrants from outside Europe. I just wondered, what is my personal connection to this law? Is it, my family came after 1965, they came in the 70s. So what is this other side of our family story, right? You think about looking up your family tree, your genealogy. To me, this was a way of doing almost political genealogy, that it wasn't just why we came here, but the country that took us and decided to take us. There was a whole history there. And, I started doing this before Trump was elected. So it really, I wasn't trying to write about the Trump years through history. It was very personal. And I thought a book would be an interesting project for me to get into, because I thought, well, if I want to know this history, I wonder if other people would like to know it too.
Well, it's a great book. And one of the things that I appreciated most about it, and that I think differentiates it from other writing on this time period and on immigration laws, is that you really tell the story of ultimately the 1965 law through the people in Congress and in the White House who were part of either writing it and supporting it or opposing it and ultimately losing out, as well as the precursor law, the 1924 law, that it's kind of diametrically opposed to what ends up being passed in 1965. So it's a character-driven narrative. And I wonder, why did you end up choosing to tell the story almost as a series of profiles of people with these huge personalities and quirks and sometimes vendettas and, passions or connections to the issue that feel really irrelevant, to the mainstream immigration debate that's going on during, their times in power? Why'd you choose to tell a story in that way?
I mean, I think I love reading history, but the history I love is the history that feels like it's about people. Immigration law, Caitlin, you're just a phenomenal writer about the subject. I think how dry it can get. It gets very, very, it's a lot of laws, so it's very legal. And the way that we've built our immigration system, I mean, there are endless kinds of visas and terminology, and it feels like just like a very dry policy issue sometimes. But as you know, and as anyone who's connected to immigrants knows, it's such a personal story. So it felt to me like there have been some very fine histories on immigration. What I wanted to do was to tell a narrative history of this law, because not only for readability, and it's kind of more the kind of book that I like to read myself, but because you kind of can't separate the fight from the people involved in it, because a bunch of them are actually themselves, the children or grandchildren of immigrants. And so that's what connects them to it. And what you learn if you look at the history is that for some, I'm thinking of Manny Seller, for instance, who was a very long time congressman from Brooklyn, whose grandparents were German Jews. And he really took up the cause and joins Congress in the 1920s and just fights these ethnic quotas for 40 years until he literally puts his name on the 1965 law to abolish them. But there are also people who are, whose parents are immigrants who are anti-immigration. People like this Nevada Senator Pat McCarran, whose parents were Irish immigrants, and he just really, really thought that we should control immigration more, and that immigrants were communists and might be radicals who'd undermine the government. So I think it shows you that when people are personally connected to immigration, their politics can kind of go in different directions. And one should not assume at all that because someone is, intimately connected in their family to immigrants, that how they feel about immigration itself. So I just thought the people involved were so fascinating. And the way they felt about the issue was so much an outgrowth of their own family's experiences. And so you kind of can't tell the history without that. And I also think immigration as a subject, to me, I mean, it seemed like an exciting challenge to, again, tell a sort of political genealogy. So it's like, even if you don't think immigration is connected to you, right? Even if you're not, waiting for a visa, or you're at the border trying to get in, the way your family got here, if your family migrated here, is totally a story about immigration policy, right? So there are ways to say, like, this actually is relevant to you at this moment. And I think of that when sometimes you hear in the debate, people will say, well, my family came the legal way. We followed all the rules. These people aren't. I think this book is a way to talk about how the rules keep changing. And so even if your family did follow those rules are probably different for someone else right now. And it's important to kind of embed, I think, your own family within that larger picture of American history and politics.
Right. And I think another thing that stuck out to me in the book is you do some record correcting to a degree on, who are the people in Congress, you mentioned Manny Sellers, or in the White House, who were, particularly passionate or connected to immigration, or who worked on immigration issues for a very long time. Also, President Truman is one example. And, those aren't figures who I think are as frequently, President Johnson as well, of course, but even President Johnson, though, the reference to the 1965 Act, of course, exists in his presidential library and it's part of his legacy. He's not the president who comes to mind first when you think about immigration. That is usually JFK, and you talk about JFK's connection to the issue, which is pretty thin, at least in the beginning and for a long part of the beginning of his political career. So I think between that and I mentioned earlier, these big personalities, these quirks and vendettas that end up playing a major role in policymaking, what do you make of all that, of the process through which immigration laws have been, ultimately passed historically, and even, now, if you see some connection? I know I do.
Yeah, I think, it's so striking because if we kind of start from the beginning with the 19 quotas, right? I mean, which were new to me. If you think about what they are, we sort of take for granted that I took for granted that, first of all, they even existed and that somebody bothered to abolish them. So just to begin with that as kind of a starting point, they essentially, we had effectively open borders. We didn't have visas. There were no numerical limits. There were obviously some really exclusionary laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882, but by and large, if you could make the journey to the US, you could come in. In the 1920s, they introduced these ethnic quotas that essentially rank ethnicities by desirability using really bogus eugenic science. And out of that system, they effectively say, we want to keep the country very white, very Protestant. So we want people from kind of Northwest Europe. We don't want people from Eastern Europe. We don't want Italians. We don't want Jews. We definitely don't want Asians, people from Africa. It's a very race-based system. And what's striking to me, I mean, you're asking about the process, is that is so codified that for 40 years, when people try to change it, people just think it's impossible to change. And in fact, people keep trying and failing pretty spectacularly. To the point where I think when I was learning the history and I got to the end, I even found myself thinking, how is this thing going to happen? I mean, there are people who are loudly for this, but overhauling the country's immigration laws is such a huge undertaking, because it's not just about, are we going to do this kind of visa or that one? It's ultimately about American identity. I mean, it's not just about who you're going to admit from the outside. It's a lot about the people who are already inside. So someone like JFK gets involved and gets support for it, because for him and his constituents, all people who are already in the US, these are people who are Italian American, Irish American, Jewish American, they feel like they really want to, they want to belong to this country. And they see these ethnic quotas from the 1920s as kind of an insult. It's an affront, right? It's saying these people are inferior and we don't want them. So there's a way in which that's what draws him into the fight. But I think until you get to someone like Johnson, who's just a total genius at getting things done in Washington, and you have all the civil rights legislation going on, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, everything else in his agenda, it's only when you have that level of momentum that it happens. But I have to say, knowing this history now, I feel even less optimistic about big overhauls, because you just see how much people fought to undo a system based in eugenics, a system that really made it impossible to admit Jewish refugees during the Holocaust, that morally a lot of people couldn't really defend anymore, but just getting it through this political system was just so difficult.
Right. You write in the book about how President Johnson, almost from day one of taking over as president, he starts sitting down with staff and gets, I think, daily, if not weekly, then daily updates on, the status of various legislation that he's trying to pass, and had a very keen awareness. Well, a very, very knowledgeable about Congress and the workings of Congress, but also just knew that every day that passed was a day he, was losing in his fight to get legislation passed. There's also so much sort of collaboration that happens between Republicans and Democrats. I mean, without asking a sort of tired question, we kind of all know about, the divisiveness of Congress, and how, it's very rare to see people reaching across the aisle today in the ways that you did see at important moments in immigration history. But I do wonder if you have thoughts on that, if you have thoughts on how much Congress has changed, and on the Congress that was around in 1924 and in 1965, that ultimately got these two very different laws passed.
Yeah, you see, it's funny, the parties are not quite as united. They fight a lot more within themselves. I think this is something that political scientists have noticed. So in the history, you see a lot of Democrats, Manny Seller, who I just mentioned, is a Democrat, totally pro-immigration. He thinks these ethnic quotas are racist and unacceptable. They've got to go. And yet in his own party, the other person I mentioned, Pat McCarran from Nevada, is also a Democrat. And he's like the biggest opponent in the 50s to all of this. So within the Democratic Party, there's a lot of division over. And then the Republican Party, too, is both, you can see sort of a more liberal side, but also a more conservative side. So it's funny, like, even though the Democrats are in power for a lot of the period that the book covers, there's so much fighting amongst them. I mean, this is sort of the heyday of the Southern Democrats, who in a way kind of resemble the modern GOP in a lot of ways. These are people who just really don't see a problem with these laws, selecting people by race. And they're in the Democratic Party with people like Manny Seller, with people like Franklin Roosevelt, JFK. So that's one thing that seems stunningly different if you go back, is that there was certainly fighting between the parties, but even if your party was in control, it was no guarantee that you would get stuff done, because within the party, there were also these really deep divisions as well.
That's true. And you also write throughout about the way this issue is covered by journalists. So I feel like I have to ask, I think you use headlines to sort of signal, significant moments, but also journalists do influence public opinion, and they influence the politicians in power at various points. So did you have takeaways about the roles that journalists have played in, the evolution, I guess you could say, of our national policies on immigration?
Yeah, I mean, there's one moment where you see public opinion really turning. I mean, historically, Americans aren't that into immigration, I'd say. Caitlin, I know this is something you're really familiar with. There's been a lot of polling going back a very long time, and most of the time, Americans don't want more immigration. They might say status quo is fine. I maybe want fewer, but it's sort of rare for people to want more. I think kind of the moral conversation about this changed a little bit after World War II, when the refugee crisis became so acute in Europe and people were beginning to kind of really understand the scope of the Holocaust and the scope of the genocide and just how much damage had been done by the Nazis. And you see this more kind of sympathetic view toward immigrants, right? In the 20s, when they passed those quotas, journalists are all in on it. They're like, those Jews and Italians, we don't want them. They're not the right kind of Americans. There's very little pushback, but over time, after the war, people begin to feel like, well, we should help these refugees, and there's actually a moral problem here. And you see it shifting how Truman sees things. And then even more over time, this whole idea of a nation of immigrants, which sometimes can feel like it's been around forever, that also really emerges later in the 1950s. And that's kind of a cause that journalists sort of take up a little. I mean, I don't know if they take up the cause, but that kind of moral argument that this is actually who we are. You can see editorial boards getting more behind it and saying, hey, wait a second, those ethnic quotas, which other journalists helped, kind of pave the way for and really championed, those really feel like they're out of step with our values. They seem, horribly racist. We're fighting the Cold War. This is an ideological war with the Soviet Union. This is indefensible. It's a little bit like, the Jim Crow laws. All of it just feels like it's an issue. And so you see kind of elites, the intelligentsia, more and more people over time kind of turning against the law. And the quotas from the 20s. And I do think without that, it's kind of impossible to imagine them being taken away.
Mm-hmm. I do think we should talk about this idea of the United States as a nation of immigrants, one that we're both very interested in the history of and the role that it plays in American households, including today. You write at one point in the book about the melting pot, a related concept, and kind of a hidden, darker, side of thinking of a country in that way. Which I thought was really interesting. Certainly not something that was brought up, when I was in public school growing up and learning about this concept. It all sounds really wonderful. So, but that was a really interesting point you made. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So in the 20s, this is a period, and it's such an important period in New York history. I mean, you just have so many new immigrants coming in who are Jewish, who are Catholic. They are transforming the city. It's impossible, right, to imagine New York without these people coming in and really shaping it and transforming it. And so there are kind of these views of sort of what it means to come here as an immigrant, right? And the melting pot emerges as a very favored metaphor. It's actually the name of a play by a British-Israeli playwright who writes a play called The Melting Pot, and it turns into kind of I guess more of a commercial hit than a critical hit. It was sort of critically panned. But essentially the play introduces this metaphor that when people come to the US, all these different kinds of people come and blend into one thing, which, like you, Caitlin, that's sort of what I was taught. I still hear that phrase all the time because it's sort of a useful metaphor. I'd say the other side of that, to think about what it really means, is that at the same time, there are people talking about, well, all these different people are coming. How are we going to make them fit in? And that question is still very alive right now, right? The question of assimilation, like, do you need to speak English? Can you keep kind of a hyphenated identity? And in the 20s, when this phrase is in vogue, it's really about, you shouldn't have any other identity. You come here and you're kind of supposed to be melted down into one thing. So you're really indistinguishable from other people. I encountered this amazing old photo when I did my research. So Henry Ford, the great American inventor, also a huge anti-Semite, he actually, for his factories, would have classes for the factory workers, and he would teach them English because many of them were immigrants. And when they graduated, the school would set up literally like a giant melting pot. Like almost in the photos, looks like a huge paper mache pot, and it says in front the melting pot. And the students who were graduating would sort of march up a set of stairs wearing kind of ethnic garb, like the stuff that they would wear, in their homelands. And they march up the stairs, they walk into the pot, and then they come out and they're all identical. And they're all wearing, the same clothes, waving little flags, American flags. So essentially the melting pot is supposed to be a way to kind of erase differences, to say, you come here, whatever you are, whatever language you're speaking, and when we spit you out of this whole system, you're all going to be the same. And what does the same mean in the 1920s of America? It means a white American, and it means not talking about being a hyphenated person, right? Even Teddy Roosevelt has been railing against this for years at this time. So it's a funny analogy because we still use it because talking about assimilation, I think, is really hard. But I think if you actually dig into what it means, it does kind of demand that people give up what they were before and really blend in completely to the point where you can't distinguish one person from the next.
It's a stunning image to think about. And I think that the phenomenon you're describing, where a phrase that is part of the common vernacular, it's not, fully thought about or considered in terms of its implications and what goes into it. I mean, that feels like a parallel to me with immigration generally and public opinion on immigration, where, as you point out in the book, often it's a combination of really an emotional kind of reaction to something about, often almost, I would say, perhaps the majority of the time about race, but sometimes about jobs and sometimes about schools or other civic institutions. It's something that everybody has strong feelings about, it seems like, but where we're all talking about different things, and sometimes the research is lacking or can be, which is fomented by the politicians who sometimes lead those discussions, as you point out in your book. I was curious what you thought of something that an immigration historian said to me recently about this idea of the United States being a nation of immigrants, which, as you point out, emerges really in the 50s and 60s. And it sounds so good, though. It seems to make so much sense when you're, sitting in an office or in a school classroom that's as diverse as some in the United States are. This historian said that, though it has not always been the story of the United States, that the myth has played a really important role, to the degree that it is a myth, in the evolution of law over time. And I think by that he meant certainly the abolishment of the national origins quotas. So does that ring true to you based on your research?
I think, that phrase is so funny because I think when I went into the book, and I try to really remember what I was like before I did all this research, because I will not pretend at all that I've always known this information. And I think what I thought was the history was, we're a nation of immigrants. That's essentially that's just etched into stone. Mm-hmm. It's effectively at the base of the Statue of Liberty, done. That's it. And my family is just part of that long line. And there are others that come, there were some who came before, there's some who come after, and that's what this is. But yeah, I think when you dig into the history, you see that we really turned very hard away from that in the 1920s. So what's fascinating to me when I started my book was that by the time you get to the 1950s, those controls, those ethnic controls, were so powerful that people just didn't even talk about immigration anymore. I mean, the publication where you now work, the Atlantic Monthly, for decades, they didn't publish a single story about immigration because there were so few immigrants here. I mean, when you shut off immigration, the only people who are still immigrants get older and older and they die off. And as a percentage of the population, it keeps dropping. And so by the time you get to the 50s, it's not really a thing. People don't talk about this idea. And in fact, it's, I was reading at one point, someone was describing, if you think about sort of powerful national mythology or ideas, people thought of America as actually as the American West was the ultimate romantic idea of what America was. And so it's not until the 50s that people introduced, well, actually, look in our past. We have all these immigrants who came. But again, they were looking at the past. They were looking at the waves of people who came. I think in school, you're often taught, the British came, then there were some Germans, some Irish, Italians and Jews, and da, da, da. But you skip over this 40-year period where there were so few immigrants that people just stopped talking about it altogether. So I think, that kind of that romanticism, I think also erases political action and power. Because if you think that that's sort of who we are and no one can change it, then it begins to feel like no one needs to fight for it or maintain it or argue for it, because it's just sort of, fait accompli. And I feel like I saw this during the Trump years. I mean, people being very upset saying, you can't do that. We're a nation of immigrants, not knowing that actually we've done it many times before. And actually not doing it is a little bit of a deviation from the norm, depending on what you think the norm is, right? You could argue that like having more immigration is actually more of a deviation, and the norm, the center actually that holds if you sort of just stop doing anything, is one where the US is, a country built on white ethnicity as being a core part of what it is. That's really what this is about. And so a nation of immigrants comes in as another idea, but it's an ideal that's in opposition to that other one, right? That your race determines whether you're American or not. And these things are very much in contention, and I don't think they're ever quite resolved, and they don't feel resolved to me right now either.
Yes, I think there's so much in the book that expands on everything that you've just said, and so I hope that people who are listening and watching can give it a read. And somewhat relatedly, I wanted to talk as well about a couple of related ideas. One being that each time you see a new law being passed, there's, you talk about each of the immigration laws as being incredibly complex, and that remains true today. They're kind of these catch-all, grab bag, pieces of legislation that have often, it seemed to me at least, like they have a real mix of things that satisfy, one side and the other, which can of course leave everybody kind of grumbling. And the 1965 law is an exception, but did have concessions as well. I mean, it's true in all of them. So there's that idea, that the cost that comes at each moment of change for whichever party is driving it. And then also you write about how there's not consensus within various immigrant groups, and how that bubble, the intergroup tensions kind of bubble up and also play a role, right, in the evolution of American immigration laws. I feel like those two are connected at various points in the book. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. When you're dealing with that kind of system, it's really hard for everyone to kind of get on the same page. And I think you're right, the more complex it gets, the harder it is. One of the central ironies to me about the 1965 law, so, it really is a very full-throated denunciation, essentially, of 1924, which, and it says, we're not going to discriminate anymore based on race or ethnicity. When you want to come to the US and you want to have a visa to be here, we're not going to have, numerical quotas based on your ethnicity. To decide that, we're going to look at other things. So what's funny to me is so what do they look at, right? Because we're kind of living with the system that the people in 1965 created. The part that's the most fascinating and weird to me is that the law really codifies that we're going to give family members priority. And this is, known as lots of different names for it: family reunification, chain migration. And this is really, this is the reason so much of my family is here. It really kind of explains why we've had this huge demographic explosion of people from outside Europe who are here, who are not white. And yet when that is put in the law as part of these concessions, it was actually designed to keep the country more white, not less. So when I was saying earlier about how there were just so few immigrants, by the time you get to 65, there aren't immigrants from outside Europe. So when people think about keeping the status quo, keeping the country white, they think, well, if the people who get priority are people whose sisters or brothers or parents are already here, it stands to reason they're going to be other Europeans, the kind of people we want. So they actually put this in as a way to keep the country, less racially mixed. And that's a concession that Johnson has to make. He's like, okay, fine, I'll do that, and we'll second to that will be sort of special skills and other things, but to really keep the country from getting sort of racially out of hand, using these in quotes, we're going to put this kind of lock-in system in. And of course, as we see by the early 70s, it all sort of spins out of control. And for the people who want to keep the country white, and that is what kind of gets us to where we are now. So I say that because it's a really interesting example of concessions that people make that don't turn out to be concessions at all, and that actually kind of backfire. But yeah, there's just this constant horse trading of what the system is, and it's so complicated. And this is where I think it's important to know that 100 years ago, it wasn't this complicated. It doesn't have to be this complicated, I guess is the other thing to say. Like, there weren't visas. There was no such thing as an H-1B anything. It was just, there wasn't this kind of paperwork. But I think the more complicated we've made it, 65 was still relatively uncomplicated compared to, I think, now. I think that's, again, to your earlier question of what does that mean for now in legislation? I just feel like it's even harder because of that complexity.
Right. Exactly. The sort of oopsie daisy outcomes of some changes in immigration law are also really interesting and speak to the complexity of the issue. You also write about how part of the reason that the 1965 law finally got the momentum that it needed in order to be passed was that Republicans kind of realized that the quotas weren't doing their job, right? Because by that time, more immigrants were coming into the United States through these exceptions that had been written for various groups of refugees than through the actual quota system. And then at the end of the book, you get to what is probably the most talked about and currently relevant, change in terms of the national news and certainly where President Biden is focused today, which is, the introduction of the limits on immigration from the Western Hemisphere. And I think that a lot of people would be surprised to know just how new those limits are. And, given how much of a role they play in our national news and on the border. Can you talk about that story a little bit?
Yeah, so there too, I think our current lens sort of lacks a lot of context and sort of the imaginary potential when things were different, right? You can sort of say like, oh, it doesn't have to be this way. So yeah, the border is a really rich example of that. So the other thing to know about immigration history is that we used to at least make a lot of our policy based on foreign policy and about how we related to other countries. So for much of the country's history, there were no numerical caps on immigration from Central and South America from Latin America. The entire Western Hemisphere was just essentially open borders again. So, that was because we wanted to have good relations with our neighbors. It was really just that. It was not about domestic politics. It was very much about foreign policy. And you see presidents over and over try to use immigration policy as a way of exercising foreign policy. And that's why we didn't have numerical limits. In 1965, when they get rid of the ethnic quotas as part of this, again, sort of horse trading to get the law passed, they concede and basically introduce for the first time numerical caps on Western Hemisphere immigration. The thinking being, if you're going to have caps, overall on immigration, why would you exempt an entire hemisphere? There should be a consistent system. So to be clear, they get rid of these ethnic quotas, but they do keep a numerical cap, right? They say every year we're only going to take in so many people, and they want to include the Western Hemisphere in that. So this is something that, the historian Mae Ngai has written an incredible book about, Impossible Subjects. But once you do that, you introduce a level of illegal immigration that didn't exist before overnight with your southern border, because before, again, no numerical limits, none of this huge visa system. You're our neighbor, we welcome you. And overnight, it's actually past this number is illegal. And so once that happens, it just creates, again, this whole population that wasn't there before. I think one thing I learned from my book is that all it takes is sort of the snap of a finger, and suddenly someone who's legal is illegal, someone who can't come can come. And these decisions are, they're not necessarily arbitrary, but they're very, the reasons they happen are just very political. They shift with the tides and the winds, who's in charge of which committee. And so this is a case where, as they try to create this law that is supposed to be about, really turning away from these horrific ethnic quotas that are based on eugenics, they're trying to sort of make the country's immigration laws be in the same spirit as all the civil rights legislation. They also introduce a new issue that we now live with today, right? Because you can't imagine saying to someone, oh, there shouldn't be any numerical limit at all from the Western Hemisphere. That would seem insane. But again, at the time in 65, that was what we were doing. And the country really turned away from that. And again, we're living with the consequences of that now, and so many families are. And so again, immigration law is a thing that happens, in the halls of Congress. It feels very far away. But with, one pen stroke, you really affect the fates of so many people.
Right. And in fact, that change is made at the last minute, right after the law has already been passed by the House. So it is fascinating to be reminded of that. And another point you make in the book is how oftentimes it seems like there's a particular group, essentially, and correct me if I have this wrong, but I think that folks who are advocating for more restrictive policies tend to be the most knowledgeable about the issue. And that a lot of times people like Manny Seller, other progressives, perhaps lose ground simply because they don't have a whole lot of support on either side of them. There's probably an intuitive explanation for that has to do with the fact that, putting your whole political career behind a group of people who can't, at least when they enter the country, vote, doesn't make a whole lot of sense, in those cold terms. But I'm just curious what you made of that, observation that you made in the book, and any other, stories or anecdotes or characters that come to mind who kind of reflect it.
When I was writing the book, I was editing stories. Back in 2017, I worked at the Washington Post. I was editing stories about the Muslim travel ban as I was writing this book, as I was in the Library of Congress doing research on all of this. And so I did keep feeling like Stephen Miller, Jeff Sessions, they would allude to 1924, 1965. They don't talk about it a lot, or they didn't talk about it a lot, but they would say things like, we really kept things under a lid in the, after the 20s, and then 65 comes along and unleashes all this stuff, and it's all inadvertent. And meanwhile, on the left, I just, I heard a lot about, we are a nation of immigrants. This is what we do. And so there's something where it felt like the conservative movement, or at least, the people who are in the Trump White House, sometimes, I don't mean this as a blanket statement of all people, but just as a general matter, it felt a little bit like they had this very clear-eyed sense of the knobs in the machine, and that there were these knobs that you could turn on and off. And I just kept thinking, like, a lot of the people who are upset by these laws maybe don't know the history here. And so when you begin to argue against someone like Stephen Miller, I even saw this, it was, I don't know if it was the left, you would see this with journalists sometimes. Like, I would see that people on CNN kind of grandstanding, like, we are a nation of immigrants, it's the Statue of Liberty. And people would say, like, Stephen Miller would be like, well, do you know about this law from 65? Do you know about these quotas? And a lot of people didn't know it. And so it became difficult to have that debate, because if you're not familiar with what Stephen Miller is even talking about, I think it's hard to then parry if you disagree, and to say that's not, yes, but we don't want to go back to the 20s. I think sometimes they were kind of operating in a different sense of the history of it, and it made their arguments potentially more potent even.
I had the same thought reading your book. In Stephen Miller certainly came to mind when you're writing about various people, powerful aides or powerful members of Congress who really, really studied and did their homework. And that's something that, I know we've written into a lot of stories, is that he was just very knowledgeable, and which was part of how the prior administration changed as much as it did in such a short period of time. And another, well, actually, let me just say now that we'd love for anybody who's watching to send us your questions, because I'll get to read those in just a few minutes. So if you have a question that you'd like me to ask, please feel free to send it along so that I can add it into the mix. Thank you for that. And let's talk about next. I think race is a prominent, I think, theme that's woven into the book. And I point that out because, you know, when we talk about immigration currently as it's debated in Congress or you know, covered in the news, it's really not, at least on its face, a discussion about race. But your book makes clear how prominent a role that has played from the very beginning. Can you talk a little bit about that history? I don't know if that was something that surprised you as well in doing your research, or if it wasn't.
Yeah, it's just so explicit. I mean, I think like we hear the phrase white supremacist a lot these days. Our 1920s ethnic quotas were literally white supremacist. I mean, they were based on bogus science saying that, you know, this class of people, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, you know, kind of a Anglo-Saxon kind of a made up category, but that those people were superior to Jews, to Italians, to Asians, to everybody else. And so that's why they had to change the immigration laws. So there's something about how explicit it is, where you kind of, it's not even a thing that I had to weave in. It really is. The history of immigration law in this country is a history about race and racism. So if that's sort of the, you know, and that's a lot of our laws were, you know, exclusionary around ethnicity. So the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act is the first one that does that, but then they create this entire infrastructure built around it. And if you listen to all the arguments, they are about, you know, we've studied the lineage and the characteristics of people of this race or that race, and these people are bad for our democracy. And what's interesting too is if you go back, it's not like the people making these arguments weren't being called racist in the moment. So that was very interesting. They were absolutely called that. What they would say, and I think you hear this argument nowadays too, is no, I'm not, I'm just saying that this country should have this kind of person. You know, you can have your kind of country with those people, but for this country, for this project, for what we want to be, these people are not going to work. You know, it's like, I don't make the rules. That's just what the science says. And if we're going to maintain a certain quality of American, we can't have these people. And so that's really that was the bedrock of our system for many, many years. And that's why when 1965 happens, it's really in the context of fighting Jim Crow. It's in the context of racism and the civil rights movement writ large that this happens. It's just that for this group of people, it's not about Black or white. It's actually about within white Americans, these ethnic gradations. So when all of this is happening, you know, at the beginning of it in the 20s, Jews and, you know, Italian Americans weren't really considered fully white. And so all of this entire fight is about, for them, a sense of, I need to belong. I need to really be counted as fully American, because within sort of the race makeup of the country, I haven't been considered, you know, fully on top or fully American. Now, the question of kind of what, you know, what that means, right? Like that kind of assimilation into being white, I think that has a lot of implications for now, because if there were Jews and Catholics who kind of made that transition and they're European, what does that mean for now? And we have so many people who aren't from Europe, where, you know, my family is not going to be white. Like that's not, I mean, maybe the definitions of these things change, but there are limits, right? If you really expand beyond Europe, that question of assimilation we were talking about, the melting pot and all of that, I mean, it gets more complicated because we've never quite done this before, where we've had so many people from outside Europe, and what that means to become American, I think is not something we fully explore because of race, right? They're not from Europe. So we are not from Europe. So what does that mean for what the country sort of gels into?
Right. And assimilation is talked about so frequently during these moments of change. And it's talked about both as, you know, an important national value, which conflicts again with the notion of a nation of immigrants, but also something that's presented kind of, I think, on behalf of the immigrant. And, you know, that in Congress at various points, people seem to argue that, you know, assimilation, you know, the ability to assimilate is, you know, something that they want to ensure before allowing someone into the country. in order to set them up for success rather than failure. And again, that begs the question too of the people who are entering the country of whether they are coming in order to live in a nation of immigrants or want to come to live in a place where everybody is the same. Yeah. So, okay, we've got an audience question. Let's bring that in. And the question has to do with intergovernmental policymaking. What can you tell us about the history of intergovernmental policymaking on immigration? I guess, did that concern for, our neighbors ever actually go further and translate into kind of governments working together to come up with these policies?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just tell one story about U.S.-Japan relations and how they really shaped American immigration policy. So again, when this felt more like, immigration was an instrument for maintaining our relationships. So when they're passing these laws in the 1920s and they're really going to effectively ban Asian immigration, they're very worried about what this means for relations with Japan. Because the Japanese government sees immigration as, as a very powerful signal from America of what it thinks about Japanese people. And so effectively, there's a Supreme Court decision where a Japanese immigrant goes before the court and says, I want to become an American citizen, which, excuse me, at the time is not possible if you're not white or, a descendant of freed slaves. And so the Supreme Court says, you're not white, you're not Black, you can't be a citizen. And when they write the 1920s law, they write into it this funny language. They don't say we're going to ban Asians. They say if you can't naturalize, you can't come here, which basically says if you're Asian, you can't come here. And when this happens, the Japanese government really loses its mind and Japanese people really get upset. There are boycotts of American movies. Someone literally commits harakiri in front of the US embassy. It's actually such an explosive moment between US and Japanese relations that there are some who believe that in the run-up to Pearl Harbor, people are still talking about the affront of this law and that, our governments couldn't really come together to figure out a way to not insult Japan. And so part of the sort of the anger that the Japanese people have against the US is you wrote a law that singled us out as being inferior and you don't want us. And so there's a diary of one of the pilots who flies into Pearl Harbor and drops bombs from Japan. And he writes about this law as a total affront to the Japanese people. And so, I guess I'm a little bit hard pressed to think of sort of cooperative moments. But I just say that to mean that I think we think of it as such a domestic political issue, but in our history, at least, it had deep ramifications on our relationship with other countries in the world.
Mm-hmm. Another question from the audience asks if you can talk about, and you've done this a bit, but I'm sure you've thought about it a lot recently. If you could talk about the relevance and the impact of your book and how it's evolved and shifted just in the past year.
In ways that I could not have imagined. So when I started the book, as I said, it was before Trump was elected. So it was really kind of this very personal exploration of American history, how to tie my family's history to the broader political history. Trump was elected. It's, as Caitlin, as you know, it was immigration just nonstop every single day. And just seeing all these laws being changed before my eyes. Then last year, my book came out, actually, the paperback comes out today, but the hardcover came out a year ago. And this was in the run up to the presidential election. And I expected, I think, immigration to play a bigger role. I don't know about you, Caitlin, in the debate, but it wasn't actually as big a subject as it may have been when Trump ran in 2016. But then really the past year is not, the meaning of the book for me, and I think some of the readers who've talked to me, is that it actually became a lot more relevant to what's been happening to Asian Americans in this country during the pandemic. So it's not really about immigration so much as what is the identity of Asian Americans? How did we get here? Who are we? What is our place in this country? And for me, what's become more clear, at least since having really just like the honor and the privilege of getting to write the book at all, is that the book is actually, in my mind, kind of an indispensable way to understand Asian American identity. Because if you don't really know how you got here and why you're here, it's hard to talk about what it means to be here. So, there are really rich histories on Asian American history. I'd say like Erica Lee's history is phenomenal. It came out several years ago. She has a new book that I recommend to people interested in this too. But I think I was trying to draw a line not between Asian Americans who are here and those who were here 100 or 150 years ago, but rather the political conditions that allowed so many of us to be here now. And that's actually a story about Jews. It's a story about, Italian Americans, Irish Americans. It's part of this bigger history. And I think once you know how recent the arrival of Asian Americans is, the way that, as I was describing, the law that allowed so many of us to be here had kind of this mixed function, mixed purpose, you begin to see just how early we are, in my mind, in establishing Asian American identity for this moment. That actually, we've never had this many Asian people here before. And for a new generation of people, I count myself as part of this, the generation out of 65, there's all this work that has to be done to say, like, who are we? Why are we here? How did we get here? And the law that allowed us to be here, I think, is such a powerful symbol and way into that question, which is so hard and sometimes painful to dig into. But if you can tie your presence with this broader fight around racial equality, around racism in this country, I think it can begin to kind of anchor people a little bit more that the story that you're writing about what it means to be Asian American is not a brand new one. It's one that's very connected to many Americans who've come before us.
As a reader, I totally agree that your book really helps to explain the moment we're living now, and not in the ways that we expected, but in a way that this concept of a nation of immigrants really doesn't. When you're reading about violent attacks and people being told they don't belong here, and if you grew up and learned that America was a nation of immigrants, you would say, well, what do you mean? Like, of course you do. And so it's very helpful. And I too thought that, especially after the Trump presidency, that, in the debates, like you said, President Biden might have talked more about immigration. It reminded me of a moment in the book that you write about where essentially, JFK campaigns on immigration and then it goes away, which I think speaks to some of the issues we've touched on about how, focusing on immigration isn't always the most politically expedient move for someone in higher office. Another good question we have here has to do with the distinctions between when people speak of old immigrants and new immigrants. Are they making a categorization that's problematic?
I mean, I think this is where there's a lot of kind of divisions among immigrants, right? It's like we shouldn't just, I said this earlier, but like we can't assume that immigrants are all on the same page politically about really anything, let alone immigration itself. I think we have all these layers of kind of what, there are a lot of categories around immigrants, right? There's sort of old immigrants, new immigrants, skilled, unskilled labor, legal, illegal. There's so many categories I think that we bring to this. And I hope what my book can help do is if you actually see the history of how these laws get made, the categories begin to kind of break down a little bit, because you begin to see how these distinctions are actually quite fine. Like we make them, we put them in our laws, we construct them together socially. But, I came away from the book feeling like, well, my family has the right papers, we were allowed to be here, but what really is the distinction between us and someone else who wants to be here who doesn't have the right papers? It happened that when my parents wanted to come, there was this 1965 law. It happened that there were, the details of it allowed for us to be here. But is there really that big a distinction between us and the people who came before, or the people who are trying to come in now? I think if there is a distinction between old and new, I guess what I'm trying to say is that in terms of kind of our ethnic makeup, that is a dramatic difference, right? Again, it's different to talk about, if you think about sort of the long lens of history and American immigration, we're at a real kind of historic peak of the percent of immigrants in our country. The last peak was, around 1900, 1910, and that was a very different group of people. So, I do think to the degree that we have sort of older and newer immigrants in different waves, the waves are different. I mean, I think we have to deal with that immigrants aren't interchangeable. The people who are here now come from different places. And I think they bring with them, not just different cultures, but they bring different political histories with them too. And I think that's something that the Democratic Party, I think, in trying to sort of get their votes and sort of fulfill this hope for demographic destiny where Democrats win elections forever because there are fewer white voters. I mean, I think one of the challenges when you think about newer immigrants and who's coming, people bring lots of different histories to this country, right? If you are Cuban, if you're Chinese, if you're from Venezuela, I mean, depending on where you're coming from, your experience of governments, of political idealism, of kind of what you're here for. I think that question of how to reconcile all these different histories that people bring, just the sheer variety, is a thing that I think we're still figuring out. So, you know, I don't know about, I think the better distinctions to make are about, you know, people more individually and where they come from, and to actually not treat immigrants as a giant group that's interchangeable, but as a very varied group. I mean, even the category Asian Americans, of course, right? Like so many ethnicities within that. And if we kind of gloss over those things, I think we kind of misunderstand all these people who are in our midst, who are new Americans.
That feels like a really great note to end on. Jia-Lin, thank you so much for having this conversation and for the great questions that came from the audience. I hope people have a chance to pick up the book. Like Jia-Lin said, it really is a history of people, and there's a lot of fascinating characters and stories that can help you understand better the moment we're living through now. So I think at this point we can wrap up. And again, thanks everybody for being part of our conversation.
Thank you, Caitlin, and thank you all for joining.
Thank you for joining us tonight. On screen, we are showing closing slides. This slide shows an image of the featured book. The cover of the book is an old black and white photograph showing a large cluster of people in the foreground, smiling and waving hats at the Statue of Liberty, which is visible across the water in the distance. The text reads, Jia-Lin Yang, One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, The Epic Struggle Over American Immigration, 1924 to 1965. One Mighty and Irresistible Tide is available for purchase online from the library shop, on.nypl.org/shoplive. Proceeds benefit the New York Public Library. Reserve a copy for free with a New York Public Library card. Visit tonight's event page to find this title in a variety of formats, nypl.org/live. The last slide shows Live from NYPL upcoming events. Wednesday, May 26th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. A Drop of Treason, Jonathan Stevenson with Gene Strauss, co-presented with the Dorothy and Louis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. Tuesday, June 1st, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Amoral Man, Derek Delgadio with Neil Gaiman. Thursday, June 3rd, 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The Words That Made Us, Akil Reed Amar with Jeffrey Rosen. For more information and to register, visit nypl.org/live.